I oftentimes get pushback of, well, God said we have dominion, or the earth, in the end times, everything's going to be destroyed. Why should we do anything now? Is often some of the first responses I get. But I can think of a specific instance where I was told both of those things. And then we kind of sat down and looked at, where do those verses come from? What is the context? Let's actually look at what you're quoting. And it turns out when we, open scripture and look what it means to have dominion, well, surrounding that verse is God creating everything and calling it good and says it's to flourish.
Today, our guest on Undaunted is William Morris. He's a 26-year-old climate activist based in Torrance, California. I hear he holds a degree in environmental science with an emphasis on ecological restoration. Man, that's deep. William is a faith organizer with Green Faith, working on the People versus Fossil Fuels campaign. He also works with Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, currently serving as co-chair of the steering committee. Wow, keeping that vehicle on the road. I like that. And serves on a number of other faith-based, interfaith, and secular climate organizations. William also has worked with faith organizations abroad. His story has been told in Rolling Stone magazine, all right, ABC News, and the BBC. And today we're fortunate enough to have him tell his story. William Morris, not the agency. Welcome to Undaunted.
Thank you.
William, how do you come to see God and the church and the world around you? And how does that fit into your work? I mean, maybe we'll first just get your relationship with God.
Yeah. We'll start small, right? Some light questions.
Always. That's what we do here on Undaunted. That's what we do.
No, absolutely. Would love to talk about that. I think it's really interesting because I started out always being in church. I think there's photos of me in the nursery at the first church I was at, born into it. Little beknownst to me, it was a very conservative, white evangelical Baptist church. And so not knowing what that meant at the time and just thinking, hey, this is church. This is what it means to be Christian. What I'm being taught here is what everyone thinks, right? And so looking back, that church, with those conservative beliefs, it was very kind of against science, not having women in leadership, not really wanting to care for the environment, all of these different things. And that didn't, sit well with me because I really loved the outdoors, and my parents would take me to national parks and go camping and things like that. And so there was this disconnect that I was feeling from what I was believing and what I was experiencing and what I'm being told to believe and to think. And that was kind of there for a while, all the way through high school until I went away for college, when I was finally able to kind of check out different churches, houses of worship on my own and see this isn't, the only way to do things. There's many, many different kinds of churches out here. There's a whole spectrum of Christianity. But one of the things that was kind of instilled in me was always to take it very seriously and be very devout, and to go, really deep into my faith and into what I believe. And so I graduated, college with that degree, wasn't sure what to do. Wasn't being taught anything, from school. So I was like, I'll do some reading myself. And I was really interested in different theologies. And so I had an environmental science degree, and I said, why don't I read up on eco-theology? What does that mean? What does my faith have to say about caring for this earth? And how do I connect those two things of my science background and my faith? And that started me down the rabbit hole, man. There's all these justice-oriented theologies out there that I had no idea. I was reading up on liberation theology, womanist theology, political theology, queer theology, indigenous theology. And yeah, those all exist. I didn't make any up. But reading all of these different writings and stories coming from people of these, marginalized and oppressed identities, and looking at how do they interpret this faith I grew up with? How much more, are they getting out of it than I was? Because I was very, unquestioning and told what to think. And so what is someone who is in a very different social location than me? How do they interpret this? And so that's when I think things really changed, my relationship with Creator and church and religion in general. I think growing up, my faith felt like I was looking through a very narrow and cloudy lens. It was a very strict kind of thing. But then, once I'm doing all this reading and listening and learning, that view changed into like this mosaic, or like a stained glass window of putting all of these different pieces together and getting a more whole view of who God is. And so now I'm at a much more progressive church, and it feels a lot more whole to me. I don't feel like something is left out, something is missing. I'm able to go back to the roots of my faith, which is about being in solidarity with those who are oppressed and vulnerable and on the margins of society. The people we're supposed to be listening to and respond to their cries and the anguish that is happening by the powers that be. But oftentimes now, Christians are cozying up and being chaplains to the empire that is oppressing people versus standing up for them, as we see often, so often lately, and what is completely antithetical to what Christ was doing.
It's so interesting because you talked about being in this, in the Southern Baptist church, in a white Southern Baptist church. I was in a black Southern Baptist church for a while. I'm a Baha'i now, but I have extensive experience in the Christian faith as well. And I have such a deep love for the teachings of Christ and the Gospels and all of that. I was thinking about this kind of this false dichotomy, and you alluded to it a little bit in your last response, that exists between science and faith, right? And it's something that I always had an issue with, man. I was like, here I am, I'm in college, I'm doing these experiments in the lab, I'm studying biology. I mean, this makes complete sense. Plus, it's demonstrable through experimentation, right? So I can see it actually happening, right? And yet I'm getting this information from certain segments of the Christian community that are telling me that this actually is false, or to second guess, right, what I'm observing in the lab and experimentation. And I think so much, it seems to me that so much of the teachings of Christ, so much of the teachings of the Bible about this harmony, right, between the natural world and the spiritual world. And in the Baha'i faith, one of our core teachings is the harmony of science and religion. So I'm thinking, I really would love to hear more specifically about the journey for you, like solving the problematics of that false dichotomy between your interest in science, which was deep and is extended and carried on to this day, and your deep love for your faith community, and for your religion. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Before you go into it, because at one point, I think we read that you were the only science major at the church at one point. And so there must have been in your mind this almost, I don't know, a battle or figuring things out. What did that look like? Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. That would often be the case of there's not a lot of Christians because of the churches and upbringing they had who are interested in science. And oftentimes at church, you're not getting a bunch of people who are scientists. It really can depend. Sometimes you do, a lot of times you don't. And so, there's a lot to unpack. And I will say at the time, I think it was hard. It felt very isolating. I think, too, because when you grow up in church like that, that's your community and those are your friends and those, are your peers. And so to kind of question that can be really difficult. People think you're wavering or they need to talk to you or something's going on. You don't seem as well as everyone else. And so you kind of keep those things to yourself, especially if no one's bringing up those kinds of questions, if no one is talking about those things. It's really hard to do that yourself. And I think looking back, I originally viewed it as I was the only one. And now I look back and I was like, oh, no, I was a perfect bridge between these two. I was able to grow up in this community, this faith community, but also bridge it with the science. And I think, like you said, doing these experiments, being in lab, doing all this stuff, it really confirmed Creator's presence in nature. For me, there is scripture in the Bible about, you can see God through an invisible God, through the visible qualities of what has been created. And everything is filled with spirit and is good. And so I think a lot of that friction really shouldn't be natural. And it's very intentional. I think a lot of times church leaders themselves, they're very politically tied as well. And so, if their politics is very anti-science and distrusting of that as well, that's going to bleed into their theology and what they're teaching. And oftentimes the people they're teaching as well kind of unquestioningly, follow that. And that can truly, be a difficult thing.
Just to add a little bit onto this, which I think is really interesting point. I found it to be really freeing once I realized that there was this synergistic relationship between the natural world and the spiritual world. That, and that to me, it was like, it allowed me to, well, first of all, there's a respect for your own kind of intellect and your own reasoning, right? Which comes from God. And then through the observational world that you see around you, and that being a reflection of God. So it's incredibly freeing. So I really appreciate your answer.
Yeah. And even to build on that, that makes me think of one of the other problems too, is oftentimes, for those who are really conservative and fundamentalist, they take the Bible and scripture very literally. And so instead of viewing these as sacred or inspired stories that, have things to teach us, we take this very literally. And so anything opposed to that is wrong. So even like the creation stories in Genesis, a literal 6 days, or, things like that versus, here is like a beautiful story of how like a creator God, created everything with intention and loves us, and this is good. And so, trying to like, instead of have a very inspired and wonderful reading that we can pull so much out of, turning it into almost a weapon against, our observable world and what we see now.
You mentioned a mission in Kenya, and that you credit Kenyans in many ways to helping you overcome some of these hang-ups.
Yeah, definitely. That was, an amazing time that I think about often. I was there with this faith-based organization called Arosha. And they're interesting because they are Christian, but they also do conservation and a lot of scientific research. And so I had not known anyone who did that here in the US at the time. And so I wanted to go where, those people were. And so traveled over there, not sure what to expect, having some hesitancy as well, because growing up in churches and seeing often mission trips and what that looks like, it's not good a lot of times. It's a very bad colonial model that does a lot of harm for people who are saying they're going to do good. And so going over there and realizing, this organization and everyone, like these people who are there working on these science projects and who are Christian are, from here. Like it's people from all over Kenya, and the people who are going there to volunteer aren't there to tell them what to do in any, way, shape, or form, but we're there to come alongside them in what they're doing, and how do we assist and how do we support them and how are we learning from them. And so it was incredible to me coming from my, social location to being over there and seeing, these are, people of my same faith, but we're out doing like experiments and research together during the day. And then, on Sunday morning, we're having like church together. And so all of that was very intertwined, and there was not that disconnect. And it felt like where I wanted to be. It felt like a home for the first time, having conversations as well with them, realizing there were not these same hangups of like, who's causing climate change, or is this real, or like anything of that sort. It was very much, we are seeing it happen. It's happening now. It's happening to us. We know who's causing it, what's causing it. And so that was, I think, incredible to me was, the way it was intertwined. And just that because of their experience there and the connection they have to their own land, they understood when stuff was off and things weren't as it should be, but also knowing they're not the ones contributing to the problem the most, where I'm coming from is. And so how do I bring back, these friends I've made in their stories, and tell it to people around me, the ones who don't believe it's happening at all, the ones who are very disconnected, and, coming back, I think was hard, after being there for so long, in a place, where people finally got it. And then I come home, and people are like, you're Christian, but you do environmental stuff. How does that work? And feeling like I'm, completely at square one, was quite, a shock.
Yeah, because it's well documented that in America, white evangelical Protestants remain just pretty skeptical of climate change. Where do you feel that denialism comes from?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a few things. The number one indicator, though, of how much people believe in climate change, if it's human caused or not, is political affiliation. After all this research has been done. And so I mean, you look at the voting record of white evangelical Protestants in the United States, and what political party they're voting for, and what is that party's belief on climate change. And you have a pretty good answer there. I think in the United States, unfortunately, we have this tie of political and religious identity together when it comes to white evangelicalism. And so that bleeds into all the beliefs, and even their own beliefs, even if it doesn't quite line up with actual scripture and what it says. Well, we have scripture that says to care for the earth, and to protect it and to guard it and all of these different things, and that we're responsible and mandated to care. That all kind of goes out the window when it comes time to vote. And so, yeah, that very, very nefarious mix of letting your politics guide your faith instead of vice versa.
Yeah. I think at the heart of some of this, too, is this kind of like arrogance, right, that comes out of a racist worldview, right? And a refusal to want to learn from the wisdom that those cultures and those communities offer. And the beautiful thing about your story being in Kenya is it's a perfect reflection of that. Here you have a community in Africa, right, that has this, that doesn't see this kind of separation, right, between taking care of the environment and their religion. They actually see taking care of the environment as an affirmation of their faith. And it seems to me that that's the space that you're in, is really helping through your example and also through your service, your service-based work, helping people to understand that, no, this is not, it's actually a negation of your faith, right? To not be a good steward of the environment. It's an affirmation of your faith to be a good steward of the environment.
Completely agree. And yeah, there's so much that goes into that, of even like what did Christianity look like at the start of the United States? And the racist foundations and how those foundations bleed into today, and what we believe and the things we think. And when it comes to climate, even our solutions to it, oftentimes those who are most marginalized and most affected get left behind when it comes to those things. Instead of looking at the holistic solution, we're looking for quick and easy. We don't want to change the systems. We just want to try and make these quick fixes and solve these symptoms. Yeah.
So, William, I know you've spent time, you talked about your time in Kenya, but I'm wondering if there was a moment, an incident that really resonated for you during your time in Kenya, and something that stuck with you that you reflect on again and again, since you've been there.
Yeah, definitely. I can think of a moment when I was in Kenya that really opened my eyes and made me think. The place I was staying was kind of along the beach. And so every time the tides would come in, there'd be a lot of trash out there, a lot of plastic, a lot of styrofoam. I was a couple hours north of Mombasa. And so every Friday, the place I was at, we'd all end work an hour early, and together we would go out to the beach and pick up trash. Something really simple, but something very consistent, to the point where the people who lived around knew we came out and did that at the same time every Friday. And so they would join us. And without a word, they were just out there ready, picked up trash with us. And one of the times I remember asking them about it. And where I was in Kenya, it's very hot, it's very humid. I didn't see a lot of elderly people out at all the entire time I was there. But when we were picking up trash, there was an elderly man who would come out in the heat and do this with us. And so I just kind of asked why, why are you doing this? His answer was that, even though I wasn't from there, I cared enough to come out and to pick up some of this trash. And he was talking about other international volunteers we had there too. And he said he was thankful that we were taking care of this land that he had lived in his entire life, who had grown up in and loved. And that he was just appreciative of that someone would come from somewhere else and take some time and do that. Yeah, it was something so simple, but something that really struck me, of just taking such a simple action of, us collectively going out to pick up trash, really grabbing the attention of the people there. And while we're not going to solve a big chunk of the problem, the next tide, there's going to be more trash. It was the action and the intention and the fact that we were willing to go out there and to help take care of, someone else's home.
This is why I think it's just so important that regardless of whatever faith you identify or anyone identifies with, that we're in this constant mode of being a seeker, that we're constantly evolving our ideas of what truth is, and that we're constantly questioning, which is interesting because many times questioning is seen as quite sinful.
And also, I think, Nava, to touch on your point, is that there's a courage associated with questioning.
Yeah. And it's a really terrifying thought that, one day you could have dozens of people behind you and who would support you no matter what, to no one being there simply because you asked the wrong questions or said the wrong things.
Can you touch on that? When you ask the wrong question or you say the wrong things, what is it that people are so afraid of?
Yeah, right. I think a lot of people in their faith, they just want to feel stable and secure. They want it to be this unquestioning rock on which they can stand no matter what. Because if that gets shaken, everything else gets shaken. When your life is based off this foundation and everything else erodes away, that's probably what's going to be left. And so you probably don't want to go fiddling with that and messing with it because who knows what else could unravel. And I think that's a lot of it is people don't want to interrogate that because it's scary and it's hard. And so oftentimes it just kind of gets shut down. Of like, no, this is what we think. And this is what this person says. This is what this old white man, Christian theologian says. You shouldn't be reading from women or people of color. You should be reading like these are the people who, really get it. Things like that. And so I think oftentimes like this white evangelicalism has its own system set up, its own people who know the truth and people who share it and the people who have the answers. And it really tries to set itself up as this is all you need. We have everything. You go to our churches, you homeschooled using our curriculum, you listen to our radio stations, you go to our stores, you go to our college, all these different things. It's its own ecosystem outside of everyone else. That really is like, you don't have to interact with this outside world and is set up for that. And so again, people who are in that, when it's more than just their church community, but it's been their whole life, even harder, to start asking those questions.
What are some of the initiatives that you're engaged in, and how do you see those initiatives as those specific initiatives that you're engaged in as solving some of the challenges that we're facing as a global human family in regards to the climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot there. So
I know. Small questions, brother. Small questions.
One of the things I initially did before I even got involved with any of these organizations was every Sunday I would just go to different churches. I would just kind of show up. And churches are looking for young people, right? So I don't have to go up to anyone. They're going to come up to me. And they kind of just ask about me. And I'm like, I finished college. I graduated with this degree. I'm Christian. And then, it piques their interest. And kind of like, oh, can you tell me more about that? Like, why did you decide to do that? Or like, what's some of the experience you have traveling? Like, the experience you had in Kenya, all these different things. And it really leads to a lot of good questions. And so kind of going to these places and like, oh, what can I give? Like a this theological presentation on it, or can I like do a little workshop, or can I just like talk to your college group or young adult group and just, see who's interested. And it worked really well engaging with young people because this is stuff they're learning in school now. It's part of curriculums now. And so they're learning about it, but no one in their, house of worship is talking about it. So what does that mean? Like, how do they connect those things together? And coming from, that same faith background, I'm able to use that language of, I might not start off strong with like climate change, but I can talk about creation care, or our role as stewards or things like that. And then work up to some of these other things. And then I got connected with Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. It's a group of Christians, of young people from all over the United States, who are kind of in the same boat. Like they care about this or they've studied it, and like maybe not a lot of people around them were doing it. So here's this network that you can get connected with. And I wish I had done this program from them when I was in college, but they have a college fellows program. And it's like helping to train and resource Christian college students in like, here's how to talk to friends, family, your church, people at your school. here's training you can do, learning how to organize. How do you put on an event? How do you talk to your elected official? How do you do all these different things? What does that look like? And so really just resourcing them to do something at their school for that year. And we have another similar fellowship called Community Fellows for those who aren't in college, but similar thing. And so how do we just every year equip another group of these young people to be leaders in their faith communities? And we do it again and again and again. And so that's really one of the most fun things that I get to do is, you know, every year get involved with this batch of rising leaders and see what the amazing things they're going to do. And it's always fun following them after, like, and seeing like, oh, hey, like they went and did that, or they work here now, what's going on? And just seeing how far they excel. It's really, really great. I love it. And then my full-time job with Green Faith is amazing because it is that mosaic and that tapestry that earlier of different faiths, of people from different countries all over the world coming together, you know, to protect our sacred earth. It's shared and it's sacred, and all of our faiths say to care about it and do something about it. So here we are. Mm-hmm. And so I get to work with a lot of volunteers who are all over the country, of just like, how do I support you in what you're doing? How can we show up? How do we have these actions? Green Faith is really into, organizing and nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience and moving towards those things, because our climate crisis is just becoming more and more urgent, and our response needs to be the same. I just enjoy talking with young people about this, and many of them are really anxious and worried, and they don't know how they can help or how they contribute. And they say, I don't know enough. I don't know enough science. And the great thing is the science is already figured out. We know what's happening. We know what's going on. We know how to fix it. We need more people like you. We need more advocates. We need more people who are good at art, who are good at music. We need all of these different things in our movement, because there's a place for everyone. Everyone has their own gifts and talents and skills, and it's just finding the place to get plugged in. And so, I amongst all the things I do, am always trying to do that as well. How do we get you to be where you need to be and where you want to be, to help us address this? Because, the more collective action we take, the more powerful we are.
We were talking about indirectly aspects of sacrifice. What, in your opinion, do we need to sacrifice in order to move towards the greater good when it comes to climate change?
Overall, what is our idea of progress? I think the more I'm learning, and the more I'm trying to learn from like a non-Western mindset, what does progress look like, and what does that mean? Because a lot of people think progress is going to solve our problems. We're going to come up with, better ideas and better technology and better this and better that. But when we're not solving these underlying systems of inequity and injustice, that progress only makes it easier to exploit people and to extract from them and our earth. And so what sort of progress is it that we are now irreparably damaging our shared home? And so what does things like degrowth look like? Do we have to have infinite economic growth? Do we always have to be growing? Our ideas of growth are tied to success, towards progressing to something better. And so I think that on either like a global scale, all the way down to an individual scale, how much do you actually need to get by? And we know, like, there are, the 1% is causing a lot of this. It's not everyday individual people. And so this is not to guilt people into or shame them in saying, like, you need to be doing more. But as a society in the US, looking at our consumption, looking at how much we use, how much we waste compared to other places, are we progressing? And even when it comes to something as simple as trash or things that might be single use, like what does it mean when the purpose of something is to be disposed of? What is the spiritual ramification of that as well? And so, in our rampant consumer and progress minded and growth-minded society. We can't keep doing things like that. And so I think learning, contentment and what is enough. And it makes me think of a story from Scripture when the Israelites are in the wilderness, don't have anything to eat. And God is providing manna, this bread for them daily. And it's enough for them. And it said when they tried to hoard it, fearing there would be a lack, it would go rotten. Only enough. What did they need? Because they were escaping from Egypt, and Scripture calls it the iron furnace. It was this industrial center which was exploiting and extracting from their bodies as they were enslaved there for their idea of progress.
You're making me think in that story. I'm thinking about Nava and I have had these conversations before, but I think about growing up and then going to college and some of the struggles I had with kind of food security. And just having a place to live from time to time, And once I got on the other side of that, and those are difficult times, and once I got on the other side of that, what I didn't realize I was cultivating through the difficult times was a deep and sincere appreciation of simple things. And I think the more that we can, as a society, as a global family, really cultivate, as you're saying, this kind of deep appreciation for enough, right? And then share the abundance that we have with others. The smaller we make, our community, the closer we make our community. That seems so, kind of spread out and kind of dealing with all of this divisiveness. But the more that we can, that we realize that we have enough, and we have enough not only for ourselves, but also to share, the more that people don't have to live with the fear of need and desperation. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that makes me think of even another story in Scripture that I think is incredibly relevant. There's a story of Jesus going up to teach on this hill or this mountaintop. And, it says there's 5,000 men who are there listening. And of course, there's women and children as well. So the number's far higher than that. And it says they're human. They're getting hungry as they're sitting there listening and need something to eat. And, this child comes up and offers their lunch. They have some fish and some bread. And it says, Jesus blesses it and passes it around. And oftentimes it's interpreted as like, oh, it magically multiplied. As Jesus, blessed it, it split and cloned it to something. I don't know. But, Jesus provided for everyone. Versus, a different interpretation of, I don't think out of all those thousands and thousands of people, that child was the only one who brought lunch, right? Other people were there with lunch as well, but a lot of them probably didn't have it. But that child is the first one who comes up and offers to share. And so with that, with the blessing of Jesus and this blessing over the sharing that's happening, I think the people who also had lunch there shared with those who didn't. And so they're having this communal lunch together. And the Scripture says at the end, there was tons left over. There was baskets of fish and baskets of bread. And so the story is saying that, the miracle here is our community looking out for another. It's sharing. It is not being afraid that there isn't enough, because look at how much is left over. The story says everyone had enough to eat. They had enough. They were satisfied. And yet there was an abundance. One of the issues as well is in our Western mind and worldview, oftentimes we see nature as scary. Like that is something to fear. You don't know what's out there. You don't know what's going to happen. Versus a mindset of nature is what provides for us. Nature is why we're alive. Like if I know the land I'm on, if I know the place I'm at, nature can provide everything I need. I don't need anything else. Nature is benevolent and good. And so I think that's another major mindset shift. And in some of the reading I was doing as well on Christianity and colonialism, a lot of these people, they would write about the land and, frame it in the perspective of the land being a woman. And it was very much, again, like, how can we extract from this land? How can we get the most out of it? And so in a lot of these cases, the land and the women were seen as the same, and how the land was treated, so too would the women be treated. How do we center the people whose voices are most marginalized, most oppressed? Those people who know the failings of our society, of the empires that are oppressing them, they're the ones who know the solutions. Those are the people who are going to be able to envision a better world for everyone, not the people who are in charge and doing the oppressing and making all the wrong decisions. Those are not the people I want in charge of the world that is envisioned for me. I think, Scripture and Jesus says it best, like the last shall be first. Those who have been ostracized and left out, those are the ones who should be in the lead. Those are the ones who have the solutions. And so I think for me, it's the same question that I ask other people too of, where do you fit in? What is your niche? What is your role? How do you envision yourself midwifing, this future that we are writing together collectively? Like every action we take is a pen stroke. And so I think for me, it is just this consistency that even if I knew that no matter what I did, like the outcome would be the same, I know I want to do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. And so I think this faithfulness to climate justice and to environmental justice and to those who are being most affected, that is what it looks like for me. It just looks like doing that day in and day out, again and again, not just for my community, which has a refinery in it that I grew up with down the street from my house. And there's so many other ones here in Southern California, lots of oil drilling, all of these things are happening. And so how do I help my own community in the future? But also how am I helping our global community as well? How do my actions and the words I speak and the things that I do contribute to that better world that is being built? Because it certainly isn't going to happen just from me, right? We're all doing this together. And so I think realizing that also helps take some of the stress off of my shoulders, that if I need to take some time off to recoup and to relax and to just be in community with others, things aren't going to fall apart because it's not all on me. We're doing all of this together. And so, I envision a much more communal collective of people in the future who are just there, meeting each other's needs, and we have a different idea of what enough is.
If you don't mind me asking, what is your ethnic background? And does it play any part?
It does. No, it really does. And I get that question a lot because it's kind of ambiguous sometimes. It's like, oh, you kind of look Asian, but not all the way. So I'm Hapa, which means I'm half Japanese and half white. And that definitely was like a touch point growing up, going to like a very white church. And the university I went to, very white as well. And kind of like experiencing like, oh, like I'm mixed, but I'm also very much being treated like a person of color and experiencing like some racism and microaggression, all these different things. And kind of like, how does that play into how was I trying to hide some of my Asianness in church or in these other spaces? And so, another outcome of whiteness, of erasing, cultural or, your heritage and your identity of who you are to fit in. And so some of that happens in white evangelical church. So you better fit in. Your identity is Christian, right? It's not your cultural or ethnic identity. And when that comes up, there can be problems. And then when it comes to activism, there's not, a ton of Asian American activists. There's some, I follow them, they're great. But a lot of them, oftentimes because we're told, Asians, you're reserved and you're quiet, you don't cause trouble, you listen to authority. All of those kinds of things play into that. And so that is something I come up against when I'm trying to organize in some Asian churches or communities, is kind of that fear of, causing a ruckus. They don't want to shake the boat. They just want to be good, especially when it comes to Christians. Like then there's that double of like listening to authority and not questioning. And so really trying to activate people in those communities of, sharing my own story of like, I was in the same place. And like, here's kind of how I got to where I am now, because even still, I'm still pretty introverted and pretty shy, and like it can be hard sometimes. But I think out of necessity of what is happening. I think I was like, you know what? I don't know who the right person is to do this, but I'm here and I'm going to speak up. And I'm going to give these talks to these churches, and I'm going to give these presentations. And I think just with the practice, that's kind of where the comfortability came in, to the point now where, I'm completely different from who I was before I started doing this. And I think just like in that same vein, if I were to tell people listening to this who are in that same spot, I'd absolutely say, we need to hear your voice. Not only will we make space for you, the space is already here. And that space can only be filled by you. And so you're necessary and you're needed. And it's not accidental that you're here listening to this or you feel that way. We absolutely need each and every one of you. So don't let anyone else try to drown out your voice or silence you. There are people out there who need to hear you. And so that would be, my invitation, I think, at the end of that, because I wish that's what I had. I wish that is what I had heard as well. And so I think a lot of what I do now is, how do I continue to be the person who I wish had been there for me when I was in the same spot they were.
Love that, man. You're making me think about, I was fortunate a few years ago to be able to spend about 30, 40 minutes with John Lewis, the late Congressman John Lewis, and went to his office on Peachtree Street here in Atlanta, Georgia. One thing that he said in that meeting, and that we have often heard him say in public spaces, is do not be afraid to get in good trouble. Get in good trouble. And you talked about your experiences with white evangelicals. You talked kind of broadly about that. And I was wondering if there was an incident, a moment, a point of reflection in which you were able to have a very candid dialogue with a white evangelical and actually move them in the direction of the work you do, help them to open up to the idea of climate justice being linked to their faith.
Definitely. It can be difficult going into these very conservative white evangelical churches and these spaces I intentionally I got out of because I couldn't be in there anymore. And so knowing what they believe and what they think. But despite that, we're all in this together, and how do we build collective action through everyone? And so I know I can speak a language that reaches out to these people. And I oftentimes get pushback of, well, God said we have dominion, or the earth, in the end times, everything's going to be destroyed. Why should we do anything now? Is often some of the first responses I get. But I can think of a specific instance where I was told both of those things. And then we kind of sat down and looked at, where do those verses come from? What is the context? Let's actually look at what you're quoting. And it turns out when we, open scripture and look what it means to have dominion, well, surrounding that verse is God creating everything and calling it good and says it's to flourish. And so what does that look like when how you treat the land is not causing it to flourish and you don't think it's good, right? That's in opposition to what the context of that meant. And the same with the other verse of, this supposedly the world is going to end and the world's going to burn up. Why should we care for it? And a response to that, I usually talk to them about, well, if you had a loved one who's in the hospital, someone who has, a terminal illness, they're only going to survive a few more months. Do you decide not to give them pain medicine, to not treat them? Do you decide to abandon them? No, you do the opposite. You invest everything into them to make sure they're comfortable and they're loved, and you're sitting at their bedside every day holding their hand and telling, listening to them and telling stories and laughing together. It's a beautiful time. It's not a time of abandonment and being forgotten. It's the exact opposite. And so when we're looking at not just one person, but the whole earth, how is it loving your neighbor to abandon them to something like that? called to lessen suffering, not the opposite. Yeah. And so that was, again, going to our shared beliefs and our scriptures really what helps reach people. I could bring all the science I wanted, all the graphs and charts. People don't care about that as much. They want to know, what are these shared values we have, and how is what you're doing connecting to those as well. And so just kind of connecting those dots of faith and climate justice and of what's happening. And people tend to be pretty responsive to that. Yeah.
Learning about your engagement, reading about you, sitting here listening to you, having the privilege of listening to you. I'm just so happy that you are not afraid to get in good trouble. And so keep shining, brother.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I look forward to all of us causing some good trouble together.